going to be honest, this is going to be a little bit of a tough love one. I want to talk about we're going to break down two ways that podcast hosts stand in the way of their show's growth. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. We are wrapping up May talking about some hard truths. And these are things, I talked a couple of weeks ago about my commuting back and forth to LA recently. And these were some things that came to me as I was listening to these shows, and as I've been listening to clients and podcast strategy intensives recently, as we've been, talking to potential production clients. These two things have been coming up over and over again, and I didn't want to just sort of list them off as fun, fixable facts, but instead dig into them, talk about the consequences of some of these actions, because I think sometimes we recognize the effects of these behaviors, the side effects, if you will, the impact, the consequences, but we have a hard time connecting them with the cause, right? We have a hard time looking at what actually needs to be fixed to solve this problem. And instead, we see the consequence, we see the side effect, we see the impact, and we try to solve it 57 other ways instead of getting real and digging in. And so we're gonna dig into both of these today a little bit. Ahead of that, I want to remind you, if you have not yet reserved your seat for the Podcasting for Profitability Roundtable, we're going to come together June 14th. We're going to be talking about monetization. So we're going to talk about the ways we monetize this show. We're going to talk about some ways we're experimenting with monetization as we roll through the summer and into Q3. We're also going to be talking about some other ways podcasters can monetize their show, some of the other wins and financial payoff that you can have with podcasting, because sometimes we got to get creative. Sometimes we want to pull in multiple revenue streams into our business, and I want to have a space where we can really discuss all that is possible, because sometimes we simply just don't know what's possible. I will also be making space to answer questions and hear feedback and give feedback. So head on over to uncommonlymore.com/roundtable to reserve your spot. Now, let's dig into the first piece of this. The first way podcasters are standing in the way of your podcast growth or their podcast growth is you're looking at your show one episode at a time. This means that you are planning, scripting, recording, editing, creating the show notes, creating the marketing materials, scheduling it, etc. You are going through the whole process one episode at a time. And here's what this problem feels like for you. Here's the frustration. You're coming to people like me. You're going to your biz besties. You're going to your business coach. You're scrolling TikTok thinking about. You're feeling like you are stuck in an endless loop of podcast production. You feel, and honestly, it probably feels more like you're stuck in an endless loop of podcast to-dos. Just as you get one episode wrapped up, it's time to start the next one. Because each episode is isolated. Each episode is its own massive lift. The other thing you're seeing is your show won't grow. Can't get traction. You can't get new listeners. When you talk to a lead and you say, oh yeah, I have a podcast episode, but they go, oh, you have a podcast? People straight up don't realize you have a podcast. You're not seeing people show up on sales calls or in conversation with you, understanding where they are or really how you can help them. And if you have a podcast and you're getting on sales calls and people don't fully understand how you can serve them, how you can impact their life or their business, it's because you're thinking of your show one episode at a time. This is one of the reasons podcast strategy intensives exist, is because I wanted to create a mechanism for people who want to do DIY their show, or people who have a process and team members that they really love and they don't want to change it. That's cool. We're not the only production game in town. If you have a process you like, you have a production style you like, you have a system that works for you. Granted, if you're feeling these ways, I would argue that your system doesn't work for you, but let's set that aside for now. If you have those things, great. Let's at least shift your planning to a batched activity. Let's at least come in and look at a section of time in the course of a podcast strategy intensive. That's usually 12 weeks, 12 episodes, a quarter. Let's look at that and look at what's happening and look at how those episodes impact each other. And this doesn't mean that your whole show becomes a series. We do series sometimes we don't. It just depends on my mood. We're doing a series next month on private podcast, quite frankly, because I'm in the mood. It's been coming up a lot, and so I want to talk about it. And we have some great assets already that I'm going to be sharing again. We're adding some additional episodes. This is something we're going to do again in August, but I can do that because I have these assets. I can do that. I can tell you what's going to run on this show in August because I batch my planning. Now, for me, planning, as I DIY my own, I do my own intensives, is planning / scripting, because I outline. I don't script this episode fully. These words are coming to you real time. I guess live to tape, but you know what I'm saying. We're not, crafting each moment of the show before I record it. I have in front of me, let's see here, I have 2 major bullet points, which are the 2 things we're going to discuss today. And underneath each of them, there's a total of, 7, 8 sub bullet points. That's it. So I do that in the planning stage. I plan the episodes in general. I put sort of the big rocks on the table, and then I break them down and I plan what I'm going to talk about. And most of the time then, in another session entirely, I batch record them. And then the team goes and they do the editing and they create the show notes, and then we create some marketing materials, and then we do the scheduling. And so each of those steps happen with different individuals on the team at different points. But even in just the part that I do, the planning, the recording, the promotion materials, emails, social posts, etc. That's me too. So the first 10% and the last 10%, basically, I batch that. I do all my planning at once. I do all my scripting at once. I do all my recording at once. These are separate tasks. Again, planning and outlining is one session for me. That's because that's how I work. But I'm not thinking about it one episode at a time. I'm not sitting down on Tuesday and deciding what I'm going to record this week and then outlining it or writing it and then recording it and then editing it and then releasing it. I've done that. There are times in my life, in my schedule, where that ends up happening. A version of that ends up happening. But I'll be honest, the one section that always happens, even if I record this episode an hour before I release it, the planning has already happened. The outlining has already happened. That stuff got batched in the context of what was happening this quarter, of what was happening in these 12 weeks. And that's why I can say to you in in August, we're running another series that I've rerun before. And I know that because I have Q3 planned. I also know that because in addition to having Q3 planned, I have a big picture idea of what's going to happen in different, I'm going to say, seasons of the year. Because I have historical trend data. Very fancy. That's what happens when you do a show for 10 years. It tells me what happens with the podcast at certain seasons. And so I make certain decisions annually. We have set pieces that are just happen regularly. We've added to those over the years. We've changed them over the years. But I can build in set pieces because I'm not thinking of this show one episode at a time. This episode makes sense in the context of the episodes that are around it. Because it's planned. Because there is intentionality in how it exists. And so I've done a few things here. I've created a more consistent experience as the listener, which helps bring you back, which helps with listener retention, which helps with conversion, which can help with discoverability, honestly, because part of what is getting my show prioritized or deprioritized in podcast players is retention time, is subscribers, is return listeners, is how quickly you hit that play button after it shows up in your feed, because you know on Wednesdays we're going to be here. All of those things can, we think, because they're super secretive about it, be impactful. And so I'm building a show that's built to do that because I'm thinking about the show intentionally. And when you stop thinking about your show intentionally, you shift from asset, from tool, from potentially contributing member of your sales team to task, to obligation, to a to-do. And that's not going to serve your goals. When you start thinking about your show as, what do I need to do to get the next episode out? Oh, what am I going to talk about this week on the podcast? Ooh, what do I need to say? What do I want to say? Then your show becomes about executing the show. And again, tough love time, feeding your ego more than it does about the listener. And when your show stops being about who's listening and helping move them forward from problem to solution, you're going to have a real hard time making money with your podcast. You want to know why? Because you're no longer making it for the people who are going to potentially pay you. You're now making it for, I guess, your ego, maybe an algorithm, but if you're not making it for the listeners, you're not making it for an algorithm. So, ego, it's expensive. It's a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of energy. And it's something that's not going to pay off. Because you have to be thinking about your show in a larger context for it to meaningfully impact your business. Again, this is why the podcast strategy intensives exist. Before that, that's why quarterly calls existed. That's why I have never produced a podcast where I wasn't involved in the strategy. Not because, what I say goes. Although, maybe. But because I don't see much purpose in your show if you do not have a plan. And let's just set aside, we use the example of entertainment podcasts around here a lot. If I had a podcast that was about whatever I wanted to talk about, we would talk about cannabis and Schitt's Creek, just 24 hours, 24/7. Right now, maybe Ted Lasso would replace Schitt's Creek because I'm currently very addicted to Ted Lasso. But that's it. That would be it. That's what I would do. And it would be for me because those things amuse me. And if it found a listenership, cool. But I'm probably not going to sell a lot of podcast strategy intensives with it. It's probably not going to move the needle in my business. Who knows what it grows into? Who knows what it would be? But I could in theory think about that show one episode at a time. What do I want to talk about this week? But even in that circumstance, where I'm not trying to build a profitable experience. I'm not trying to impact a business. I'm not trying to build an audience to sell sponsorships. Even in a situation where I want to garner absolutely no financial return, when I think about the podcast one episode at a time, I make it harder for me. Because rarely does our best work come from sitting down and going, what should I do? I'll do this. Spitting it out and throwing it up. It's not going to catch meaningful traction. It's not going to deliver in the way I want it to deliver when I'm thinking about it one piece at a time, when each episode of the show lives in isolation. This podcast is not about episode 604. This podcast is collectively about all of the components around it. It's collectively about moving the listener through a journey. And that brings us to our second piece. Because it gets hard to deliver on any kind of promise when we're thinking about our show one episode at a time. I talk a little bit about podcast promise here. I talk about it a lot when we're in conversation with leads and with inside of our work, but I haven't talked a ton about it here. And I'm going to make a meaningful effort to talk about it more here, but this is the second piece. This is the second thing standing in the way of podcast growth, is that you're not delivering on your podcast promise. Because sort of bridging these together, you're having to be so focused on just getting the next episode out that it doesn't become about, does this podcast do the job of delivering on the podcast promise? It becomes about, did I do the job of delivering on an episode being released? And an episode being released every week is not the promise of your podcast. The promise of your podcast is that stuff you put in the trailer, that stuff you put in the description, the reason why you wanted to podcast, the thing you want to deliver, helping your audience move from problem to solution. And that solution might be work with you. That solution might be, I got everything I needed from right here. That solution might be, I realize that I do need this solution, but you're not the right fit. Right? The job of this podcast is as much to attract the right fit clients as it is to let the poor fit clients know there's someplace else better for you. So what does this look like? What does not delivering on your podcast promise look like? Well, it looks like bringing guests on your show because they will maybe help grow your show. I'm assuming you heard the heavy air quotes in the tone. It can look like talking about whatever you want, whatever feels top of mind, even when it's completely irrelevant to your listener. We had an example at some point in the last several episodes where I talked about this idea of like 35 lessons I've learned in 35 episodes of the podcast. If you're somebody who has a podcast on, I don't know, underwater basket weaving, for professional underwater basket weavers and how they can build a more profitable underwater basket weaving business, they don't care about the 35 lessons from your 35 episodes of podcasting because that's not the promise of your podcast. If I came on here and talked about my deep love of cannabis and Ted Lasso, I would not be delivering on the promise of this podcast. Now, should I start another show where I get stoned and tell you about the latest episode of Ted Lasso, or like we do a Ted Lasso rewatch? Abso-freaking-lutely I should. If you demand it, I will create it. But that's not going to happen here on the More Profitable Podcast. That's not going to happen in the podcast newsroom. Because it doesn't deliver on the promise of this show. This will hurt your listener retention, which makes it harder for your listeners to share your show, which makes it harder for you to build an audience that cares enough about your show to share your show, which makes it hard for your discoverability to be there, which makes it hard for you to convert. because they're not building trust, they're not building relationship, if they're not getting what they need to get a better idea of how to solve their problem from your free content, why would they pay you money? This hurts your show at every stage. And when there's a reason we're talking about these things together. Because when you are looking at your show one episode at a time, it becomes really, really difficult to consistently, at a high level, be delivering on your podcast promise. The promise of this show, as I think is clear, is teaching you, helping you see that it is A, possible, B, doable, and C, here's how we can help you build a podcast that generates, educates, and converts right fit clients. So that's what we talk about week in and week out. Every week, over and over. That's what we talk about because that is the promise of this show. That's what this container is built to do. And so I have to take a step back and look at, cool, what do they need to know now? What's happening in these 12 weeks? Where do we need to move them to? You know, if I had more of a launch model, that would certainly be relevant in these questions. But for us, we sell two things. It's a wildly simple business. Podcast production, podcast strategy. We either do this week in, week out together through production, or you and I sit down 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a year, and we build out your content plan. And then you go week in, week out. Then we'll come back together. We'll evaluate the data. We'll plan the next 12 weeks. That's it. Those are the things we sell. And so this promise of this podcast is in line with helping you move towards one of those two things. And for some people who listen to this show, we go on dog walks and we pick up the kids from carpool and we hit the treadmill and we run the track and we do those things. We wash dishes, we make dinner, whatever it is. And that'll be enough because it keeps you engaged in this. It keeps you thinking this way. Then I've still lived up to the podcast promise, even if you never buy. But if I want to keep walking the dog with you and keep running carpool with you and keep going on the treadmill with you and keep cooking dinner with you and keep doing dishes with you, which by the way, I don't even do dishes in my house. I don't know how you con me into doing it with you. But if I want to keep that going, I've got to be delivering on the reason you showed up in the first place. And I cannot do that when I'm consistently focused on just getting this to-do list checked. And here's the shitty part nobody wants to tell you. This is really hard to do alone. This is wildly unsustainable to do alone. Now, does that mean you need to hire Uncommonly More or a production agency like us for week in, week out production forever and ever? No. Support can look like a lot of things, but it needs to look like something. So maybe that's sitting down with me for a podcast strategy intensive. Maybe that's finding a biz bestie to help you brainstorm your content plan. Maybe that's using body doubling. You know, I shout out to my friend Jo Gifford. She got me totally hooked on this tool called Flown. I'm sure I'll talk about it at some point. I love it. I can drop in, be in a community. As I'm recording this right now, I'm in a Flown session because it was much easier for me to sit down and get this batching done when I had the accountability of a group of people. And we're all on mute and they're not hearing this and they're all working on their own thing and I don't even know anyone in this room. But having it up on my screen helps me get it done. And so I'm getting it done. That's support. Now, for me and for our production clients and maybe for you, this then looks like having the editing done, getting the transcripts written, getting the show notes handed to you, having the graphics ready, whatever. Maybe that is what support looks like. And if that's what you're ready for support to look like, let's have a conversation. But if you're not doing anything right now, as far as getting support, if you're just raw dogging this whole thing by yourself, that's unsustainable. Because you are going to be in and out of periods, if not consistently in a period, of just trying to get your show done. And that's how you end up looking at your show one episode at a time in isolation. And it's how you end up so far from the promise of your podcast that you have no idea how to bridge the gap between your show and your offers. And it's time to change that. So let's have a conversation. Head over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive. Learn about podcast strategy intensives. Head over to uncommonlymore.com/podcast production. Learn about production services. Either way, either one of those channels will book a call with me. Let's have a conversation. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.